In 1988, the heavy stamping presses at the Westclox factory in Dumbarton, Scotland, finally went silent. For 40 years, this massive industrial center had produced over 30 million mechanical alarms. At its peak, 1,400 workers built the Big Ben and Baby Ben clocks that reliably woke up half the nation. Then the assembly lines were dismantled. High street jewelers stopped ordering them. The loud brass-geared bell that once commanded the morning routine was suddenly discarded as a bedside nuisance. The paradox was absolute. A machine engineered specifically to demand human attention had become the one thing the public chose to ignore. But the real story of Westclox in Scotland is not just about a factory closing its doors to cheap quartz imports. It is the story of how the working-class bedroom learned to measure the night. And what happened when a culture decided it no longer wanted to wind the hour. Every week, we tell the stories of British timekeepers, workshops, and factories that once taught the country how to live with time, and what happened when the market moved on. If that history matters to you, subscribe, and let us return to the exact moment this empire was born, in the Vale of Leven, Scotland, in 1948. In the years immediately following the Second World War, the British morning was a fragile, high-stakes system. The nation was attempting to rebuild a shattered economy, heavily reliant on manufacturing, coal mining, and transport. That recovery required millions of workers to arrive at factory gates, shipyards, and railway depots with absolute punctuality. But keeping time in the late 1940s was a systemic problem. The traditional British horological industry, which had spent 2 centuries perfecting the elegant long case clock and the precise fusee wall clock, was structurally incapable of solving this issue. A beautiful mahogany bracket clock in a middle-class sitting room was a symbol of domestic stability, but it was useless when it came to violently waking a tired worker in a freezing bedroom at 5 in the morning. Before the war, the British public had largely relied on cheap, imported German alarm clocks to rouse them. When the conflict severed those trade routes and post-war rationing gripped the country, the working-class bedside table was left empty. The problem was not a lack of timekeeping knowledge in Britain. The problem was the sheer cost of domestic mechanical reliability. Existing clocks were breaking down, and the local clock repair bench was overwhelmed with failing pre-war springs. The problem was not simply a lack of clocks. The problem was the complete collapse of the cheap, reliable alarm supply chain. Simultaneously, the British government placed severe restrictions on American imports to conserve depleted dollar reserves. A British family could not simply buy a newly manufactured American alarm clock from a high-street jeweler, because those products were forbidden from crossing the Atlantic. Enter the General Time Corporation, the colossal American parent company of Westclox. Westclox had already conquered the American bedside table with its legendary Big Ben and Baby Ben product lines. They understood the psychology of the working morning better than anyone. But to capture the massive, starved British market, they could not export. They had to build the clocks inside the British economy. They needed to establish a factory that could replicate their American mass production system while using local labor and materials to bypass import tariffs. In 1948, they found their solution. They did not choose the historic clock-making districts of Clerkenwell in London, nor the old watchmaking center of Coventry. Instead, they looked to the Scottish lowlands, settling on the Vale of Leven industrial estate in Dumbarton. American time logic was about to be transplanted directly into heavy Scottish industry. Dumbarton was an area steeped in shipbuilding, heavy engineering, and the unforgiving labor of the River Clyde. It was an environment defined by massive steel plates and roaring furnaces. The dissonance was striking. These Scottish workers, surrounded by the ghosts of heavy industry, were now tasked with assembling the delicate components of a clock movement, the internal mechanism that makes a timepiece run. The new Strathleven factory was a marvel of mid-century industrial planning. It was not a dusty, romanticized workshop. It was a vast, brilliantly lit production facility designed for relentless volume. Westclox hired hundreds of local workers, many of them young women whose smaller hands were perfectly suited for the meticulous assembly of tiny brass gears, steel pinions, and balance wheels. They were building a machine that required a mainspring, a coiled strip of metal that stores energy when wound with a key. This spring had to be powerful enough to drive the hands and trigger a ringing bell with shocking authority, yet cheap enough to stamp out by the tens of thousands. The initial models to leave Dumbarton were not just functional boxes, they were designed with an almost architectural dignity. The Big Ben was a heavy, commanding presence, sitting on a pedestal base with a large, legible face. The Baby Ben offered the same mechanical reliability in a more compact, bedside-friendly case. These were not disposable items. They were housed in painted metal cases with polished bezels, giving them a weight and permanence that belied their low cost. By late 1948, the first Scottish-made Westclox alarms began to roll off the assembly lines. When they finally appeared in the windows of British high street jewelers and in the pages of mail-order catalogs, they carried a subtle, "Beginnes and McCain said a wow," masterful piece of commercial positioning. Printed at the very bottom of the dial, the clock face that carries the numbers, were three words: "Made in Scotland." This was not merely a geographic statement, it was a psychological hook. It transformed an American corporate design into a trusted piece of domestic engineering. It assured the British buyer that this ticking metal object was built by local hands, supporting the local economy. Owning one quickly became a minor domestic event. In a typical British home of the late 1940s, often damp, relying on a coal fire and lacking central heating, the bedroom was a cold and uninviting place. Waking up was a grim necessity. The Westclox alarm did not coax the sleeper, it commanded them. The sound of a Westclox strike, the violent mechanical ringing of a hammer against a metal bell, was engineered to cut through deep sleep and the thickest blankets. It was a harsh sound, but it was a trusted one. To wind a Westclox at night became an act of faith. The user turned the stiff brass key on the back, feeling the tension of the steel mainspring coil tighter and tighter within its barrel. That physical resistance was the tactile proof that the clock would do its job. If you wound the clock, it would wake you. It was a simple, unbreakable contract between a Scottish factory worker and a British family. The factory had successfully brought American mass production to Scottish soil. Now, it had to convince the British public that this heavy, ticking metal object was the only way to start the day. For the Dumbarton factory to succeed, Westclox Scotland could not simply rely on the post-war shortage of goods. They had to deliver a machine that fundamentally solved the morning routine for the British working and middle classes. The answer came in the form of two specific models that would soon dominate the domestic market: the Big Ben and its smaller, equally loud companion, the Baby Ben. These were not delicate instruments meant for quiet admiration in a formal sitting room. They were utilitarian lifelines. But engineering a cheap, mass-produced clock that could withstand the daily physical abuse of a working household was a profound industrial challenge. At the heart of the Dumbarton clocks was a remarkably robust movement, the internal mechanism that makes a clock run. Traditional British clockmaking had always prided itself on thick brass plates, finely cut pinions, and individual hand tuning. The Scottish Westclox movement, by contrast, was a triumph of pragmatic engineering. It was designed to be stamped out by heavy machinery, assembled rapidly by line workers, and yet remain durable enough to last for years on a bedside cabinet. The power source was the mainspring, a coiled strip of metal that stores energy when wound with a key. In a cheaply made clock, a mainspring can easily snap or lose its tension under daily use. The Dumbarton springs were forged to be resilient, requiring a firm, deliberate turn of the built-in brass keys on the back of the case. Every night, millions of British workers performed this exact ritual. They would set the alarm dial, wind the alarm spring, and then wind the time spring. Often, when these clocks eventually stopped years later, owners would claim the clock was overwound, a common owner phrase for a clock that has stopped after being wound, usually because the movement needs service, cleaning, or oil, rather than because the spring is actually too tight. But in their prime, these Scottish mainsprings rarely failed. That stored energy was released through the escapement, the mechanism that releases power one beat at a time and creates the tick. Because the Dumbarton movements were unjeweled and housed in hollow metal cases, the sound of this escapement was incredibly loud. In a quiet terraced house in Yorkshire or a cramped flat in London, the relentless, metallic ticking of a baby Ben echoed against the bedroom walls. It was not a soothing sound. It was the sound of industrial time invading private space, a constant auditory reminder that the morning shift was approaching. But the most critical component was the alarm mechanism itself. The strike, the sound made when a clock triggers an alarm on a bell, had to be infallible. Westclox engineered the Big Ben with a unique concentric bell system, where the entire back of the clock case acted as the gong. When the alarm tripped, a small metal hammer vibrated violently against the steel casing. The resulting noise was a jarring, sustained ringing that could penetrate the deepest exhaustion of a coal miner or a shipyard welder. It was the mechanical equivalent of a bucket of cold water. Yet to put these ticking metal boxes into millions of British bedrooms, Westclox had to navigate the strict hierarchy of British retail. This was the second great force of the British clock market, the power of the high street jeweler and the catalog. Westclox did not want their clocks sold merely in hardware shops alongside hammers and nails. They wanted them positioned as legitimate timepieces. They successfully convinced independent British jewelers and major high street chains like H. Samuel to display the Scottish-made Big Bens in their shop windows. There they sat just inches away from expensive silver pocket watches and traditional English mantel clocks, clocks designed to sit on a mantelpiece, shelf, or sideboard. This retail placement was a psychological masterstroke. It told the British consumer that although a Baby Ben cost only a fraction of a traditional clock, it was still a piece of respectable horology. It was a proper clock, backed by the trusted reputation of the local high street jeweler who sold it. If it broke, you could take it back to the jeweler's repair bench. Simultaneously, Westclox Scotland tapped into the booming mail-order catalog market. Catalogs like Kay's and Littlewood's were becoming the primary way working-class British families bought household goods on credit. A full-page color spread in a catalog could put the image of a gleaming modern Westclox alarm into millions of living rooms, from Cornwall to the Scottish Highlands. To further secure their dominance, Westclox championed the luminous dial, the clock face, the piece that carries the numbers, treated with a radium or tritium-based paint that glowed in total darkness. In an era before glowing digital displays, and in homes where keeping a bedside lamp on all night was a waste of expensive electricity, the ability to open one's eyes in the dead of night and immediately read the glowing green hands was a technological luxury brought to the masses. It provided a profound sense of control in the dark. This dual distribution breakthrough, respectability on the high street, and mass accessibility in the catalogs, created a consumer phenomenon. The question of whether a mass-produced, stamped metal clock could be trusted was decisively answered by the sheer volume of sales. The British public bought them not just because they were affordable, but because they worked. They represented a massive shift in timekeeping power. A family no longer had to rely entirely on the distant sound of a factory whistle or a church turret clock, a large clock mechanism used to drive the hands on a tower or public building. They now owned their own time. They could set their own waking hour. The clock on the bedside table became the ultimate arbiter of the British working day. The mechanism was cheap enough to own and reliable enough to trust. Soon, the sound of the Dumbarton escapement would become the background noise of the British night. By the early 1960s, the Vale of Leven industrial estate was no longer just an outpost of an American corporation. It had become the pulsing mechanical heart of British domestic time. Westclox, Scotland was producing over 2 million clocks a year. The Dumbarton factory floor was a roaring, meticulously orchestrated ecosystem of brass, steel, and human precision, employing a peak workforce of 1,400 people. The workers making these clocks were the very same working-class people who relied on them. They were assembling the instruments of their own industrial discipline. Every week, articulated lorries left the Scottish lowlands carrying tens of thousands of boxed Big Bens and Baby Bens southward. They flooded the distribution centers of the Kays and Littlewoods catalogs. They filled the stockrooms of every major high street jeweler in the country. From the independent watchmaker in Coventry to the expansive, brightly lit displays of H. Samuel in London, the brand had achieved total market saturation. But they had achieved something much deeper than mere retail dominance. They had embedded themselves into the nightly psychology of the British household. To understand the true scale of Westclox's triumph, one must look past the production numbers and into the peak British bedroom of the 1960s. In a British bedroom, where the cold morning air and the exhaustion of industrial labor made waking a daily battle, the ticking Westclox on the bedside cabinet did not merely show the hour. It enforced the discipline of the nation. The mechanical alarm clock was the anchor of a strictly regimented household timekeeping culture. In an era when most working families operated on rigid shift patterns at local factories, shipyards, or railway depots, the bedside clock was not a passive observer. It was an active participant in employment survival. If the clock failed, the worker was late. If the worker was late, wages were docked. The stakes of that small brass mechanism were entirely economic. Because of this, the act of winding the clock became a mandatory evening ritual. When the house was quiet, the final action before turning off the bedside lamp was to reach for the cold metal case of the Baby Ben. The firm, resistive turn of the winding key, tightening the mainspring within its brass barrel, was a tactile confirmation that the morning was secure. The user was not just winding a spring, they were winding their own commitment to the next day's labor. This ritual created a profound, unshakable trust. A family might pass down a fine English long case clock, a tall floor-standing clock with a pendulum and weights inside a wooden case, as a piece of inherited furniture. But the Westclox was intensely personal. It sat inches from the sleeper's head. Its loud, rhythmic escapement, the mechanism releasing power and creating the tick, was the universal soundtrack to the British night. It was an aggressive, metallic heartbeat that millions of people learned to sleep through simply because they trusted it would wake them when it mattered most. Back in Dumbarton, the factory operated at a relentless pace. The production lines were a marvel of mid-century engineering, heavily reliant on the skilled hands of Scottish women. These workers handled delicate hairsprings, fine spiral springs that control the balance wheel, and fitted them into thousands of movements a day. The factory had its own rhythm, dictated by the very machines they were building. Westclox, Scotland did not just assemble imported parts. They stamped their own metal cases from massive sheets of steel, cut their own brass gears, and painted their own luminous dials. The Made in Scotland mark became a genuine point of industrial pride. The town of Dumbarton, historically defined by the heavy shipbuilding of the River Clyde, had successfully pivoted to precision manufacturing. The factory gates saw generations of the same families walking through them, their lives dictated by the factory wall clock, a large legible timepiece used to coordinate labor, and the alarm clocks they built on the benches. At this point, Westclox seemed invulnerable. They had mastered the trinity of mass manufacturing: low cost, high volume, and unbreakable domestic trust. But true dominance always masks the first signs of obsolescence. The sheer volume of clocks leaving Dumbarton meant that the mechanical repair trade, the traditional backbone of British horology, began to experience a subtle, structural shift. For centuries, the High Street clock repair bench was a place of reverence, where a skilled clockmaker would spend hours cleaning plates, rebushing worn pivot holes, and adjusting pendulums. A bushing, a small repair insert used to tighten worn pivot holes in a clock plate, required time, skill, and money. But the Westclox Big Ben challenged the fundamental economics of the repair bench. When a Scottish-made alarm clock finally stopped working after years of daily abuse, the owner faced a dilemma. Taking it to a local jeweler for a full service, cleaning, lubricating, adjusting, and repairing the clock so the movement could run reliably, often cost almost as much as buying a brand new clock from the Kay's catalog. Many independent jewelers began to view mass-produced alarm clocks as a nuisance. They were notoriously difficult to service profitably. The metal plates were stamped, not milled. The springs were under immense tension. When a customer brought in a broken baby Ben, the repairer would often just replace the entire movement rather than fix the individual gears, or worse, politely advise the customer to simply buy a replacement. This was the silent inception of replacement culture in the British timekeeping market. The Dumbarton factory was so efficient at producing affordable time that they were inadvertently teaching the British public that a clock was not a generational heirloom, but a consumable household good. Yet, in the 1960s, this shift was masked by record profits and immense cultural presence. The demand for the physical, ticking clock was absolute. Millions of people still believed in the winding ritual, the physical interaction with the machine, the tension of the mainspring, the setting of the brass hands, the pull of the alarm stop button, was deeply ingrained in the working class psyche. To maintain their momentum, Westclox Scotland expanded their lines. They introduced new variations, new case colors, and modernized dials to match the changing aesthetics of 1960s interior design. They exported heavily, sending their Scottish-made timepieces into Europe and across the Commonwealth. The factory floor in the Vale of Leven felt invincible. There was, however, a profound dissonance at play. The British public loved the reliability of their Westclox, but they were beginning to subconsciously resent the noise. The loud, aggressive tick of the unjeweled escapement, which had once been a comforting guarantee that the clock was working, was slowly being recast as an annoyance. As post-war rationing gave way to the rising living standards of the 1960s, British homes became slightly warmer, slightly more comfortable, and increasingly focused on domestic peace. The harsh, industrial sound of a Dumbarton-built alarm mechanism felt increasingly at odds with this new desire for a quiet night's sleep. Furthermore, the retail landscape was expanding. While high street jewelers still proudly displayed the Big Ben, department stores were beginning to showcase a different kind of timekeeper, one that did not require a winding key at all. The seeds of obsolescence were not sown by a sudden drop in quality, but by a gradual shift in what the British consumer considered convenient. The mechanical clock had conquered the night, but the night was about to demand silence. The workers, the management, and the high street retailers all operated under the assumption that the mechanical mainspring was a permanent fixture of human existence. They believed that people would always need to hear a loud metallic bell to wake up. The mechanical alarm clock was at the absolute peak of its cultural power, sitting confidently on millions of bedside tables across Britain. The Scottish factory had mastered the mechanical bell, but the definition of how the British bedroom should sound was already beginning to quietly change. The long decline of the massive Westclox factory in Dumbarton did not begin with locked gates, mass redundancies, or a sudden collapse in manufacturing quality. The first fatal crack in their British empire was entirely silent. It began with a plug. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, the British household timekeeping culture began to undergo a subtle but profound shift. The synchronous electric clock, an electric timepiece whose motor keeps time from the frequency of household electrical current, had already conquered the kitchen wall. Now it was moving into the bedroom. For the first time, a British worker could buy an alarm clock, plug it into the skirting board, and never touch it again until the alarm went off. This was not merely a technological upgrade, it was a psychological severing. For decades, the power of the Big Ben and Baby Ben rested on the winding ritual. The firm resistance of the brass winding key, the physical act of tightening the mainspring, was the tactile contract between the user and the machine. When the electric plug removed the need for the key, it also removed the daily interaction that had built generations of trust. The alarm clock ceased to be a machine you actively maintained. It became an appliance you simply expected to work in the background. This small domestic crack prepared the British market for a much larger, far more devastating force: the Asian quartz revolution. By the mid-1970s, the British high street was flooded with a new kind of timekeeper. The quartz movement, a battery-powered mechanism regulated by a vibrating quartz crystal rather than a swinging balance wheel, fundamentally destroyed the economics of mechanical time. Quartz clocks did not require heavy stamping presses. They did not require a workforce of 1,400 skilled Scottish laborers assembling delicate hairsprings and brass pinions. They were powered by cheap, easily replaceable batteries. And crucially, they were silent, or at least far quieter than the aggressive, unjeweled escapement of a Dumbarton-built mechanical alarm. The dissonance between what the Dumbarton factory was built to do and what the British consumer now wanted was absolute. Westclox, Scotland was a heavy industrial facility designed to punch steel and cut brass. It was an analog giant, waking up in a digital microelectronic world. They were producing a loud, heavy ticking machine for a bedroom culture that now valued silence, lightweight plastic, and zero maintenance. Faced with this immense price pressure from imported quartz clocks, the American parent company, General Time Corporation, forced Dumbarton to compete in a race to the bottom. This triggered the most destructive phase of domestic manufacturing costs. Because British labor and raw metals were becoming too expensive, the factory had to find ways to make the traditional mechanical clock cheaper, just to survive in the catalogs. The decision was made to begin substituting traditional brass and steel components with nylon and plastic. The heavy, resonant metal cases that had given the original Big Ben its commanding presence were swapped for thinner, molded plastics. Inside the movement itself, plastic gears began to replace the brass wheels. This was a fatal compromise. The entire British trust in Westclox had been built on rugged durability. When a family bought a mechanical clock with plastic internal parts, the immense tension of the steel mainspring would eventually warp or strip the plastic gear teeth under daily use. Suddenly, the old excuse that a clock was simply overwound was no longer just an owner's misconception. It was a literal mechanical failure. The clocks were breaking, and they were breaking quickly. The consequence rippled straight out of the bedroom and onto the British High Street jeweler's repair bench. Historically, if a Baby Ben stopped ticking, it was taken to the local watchmaker or jeweler for servicing, cleaning, lubricating, adjusting, and repairing the clock so the movement could run reliably again. But when a repair technician opened the back of a late 1970s Westclox and found stripped plastic gears instead of brass plates, the economic equation of repair collapsed entirely. A bushing, a small repair insert used to tighten worn pivot holes in a metal clock plate, cannot be applied to cracked plastic. The jeweler would hand the broken clock back to the customer and deliver a sentence that would permanently alter British horology. It is cheaper to throw it away and buy a new battery one than it is for me to fix it. This was the birth of true disposable time in Britain. The mechanical clock, once an object of respected industrial labor, had been downgraded to a disposable commodity. The K's and Littlewood's catalogs quietly began shrinking their mechanical clock sections, replacing them with pages of sleek, imported quartz alarms and the newly arriving digital displays. The mechanism that had taught the country to trust the hour was now struggling to justify its own repair. The British bedside table was no longer a place for heavy metal and daily maintenance. It was becoming a space for silent plastic and cheap batteries, leaving the massive Dumbarton factory fighting a war it was physically incapable of winning. As the 1980s dawned, the industrial reality for Westclox, Scotland turned from a struggle for relevance into a fight for survival. The factory in Dumbarton, once a pillar of the Vale of Leven's economy, was becoming a massive, expensive liability for the American parent company. The global timekeeping market had fundamentally shifted, and General Time Corporation, now part of a larger, globalized conglomerate, began to view the Scottish facility as an outdated relic of an era that had already passed. The corporate strategy became ruthless. To try and offset the plummeting sales of their traditional mechanical alarm lines, management forced the factory to pivot toward cheaper, imported components. The assembly lines, which had once been filled with the rhythmic precision of Scottish workers fitting brass movements, were now largely dedicated to housing cheap, imported electronic modules in plastic shells. The Made in Scotland mark, which had once been a promise of local industrial pride, was now being applied to products that felt increasingly foreign to the loyal British customer. The loss of identity was palpable on the factory floor. For the workers, many of whom had been there for decades, the job was no longer about the craft of mechanical timekeeping. It was about the frantic, low-margin assembly of disposable gadgets. The pride of the Dumbarton manufacturer was being stripped away, layer by layer, replaced by the crushing pressure of cost-cutting. By the mid-1980s, the writing was on the wall. The British High Street had fully embraced digital time. The bedside clock radio, a device combining a clock, alarm, and radio receiver, had become the new standard for the modern bedroom. Why wake up to a harsh mechanical bell when you could wake up to a pop song or a news broadcast? Why bother winding a key when a digital display glowed silently, requiring nothing but a plug-in? The Westclox brand name still existed, but its meaning in the British market had been hollowed out. It was no longer a synonym for industrial reliability. It was just a brand on a shelf, competing with dozens of other identical cheap plastic imports. The end came with a jarring, predictable finality. In 1988, General Time Corporation made the decision to cease all manufacturing operations in Dumbarton. After 40 years of service, the May 6 in Durshabah, the Vale of Leven factory, the home of millions of Big Bens and Baby Bens, shut its gates for the last time. The machinery was dismantled and sold off. The thousands of workers whose lives had been structured around the punch clock and the bell were left to find a new rhythm in an economy that had outgrown them. The closure was not just the end of a factory, it was the final formal conclusion of mechanical bedside time in Britain. The machines that had enforced the start of the morning shift for a generation of workers were now officially obsolete. The catalog stopped listing them. The jeweler stopped stocking them. The spare parts supply dried up. The winding key went missing. The bedside became silent. The clock became landfill. The shift moved to plastic. The time moved to digital. The factory became empty. The closure of the Westclox factory in Dumbarton did not silence the history of British bedside time. It merely turned the page from production to preservation. Today, the Westclox legacy in Britain is maintained not by industrial assembly lines, but by a vibrant, fragmented network of collectors, restorers, and those who simply refuse to let the sound of a mechanical bell fade into the digital past. These clocks have survived the transition to a disposable, screen-dominated world, precisely because they were built with an unwavering, brutal honesty. They were never meant to be smart, nor were they designed to be replaced by a software update. They were built to perform a single, mechanical task: to store energy, to measure the passing night, and to demand that the owner wake up. In the quiet corners of the British antique trade, at car boot sales in damp fields, on dusty shelves in high street charity shops, and in the curated listings of online auction rooms, one can still find the heavy painted metal cases of the Big Ben and the Baby Ben. Many are non-runners, listed as needing service or simply marked as decorative. Yet for the initiated, these are not broken objects. They are puzzles waiting for a skilled hand. The British horological community, including the British Horological Institute and local societies of antique clock enthusiasts, continues to value these machines, not because they are rare, but because they remain the most accessible entry point into the mechanics of the past. To take a 1960s Scottish-made Westclox to a repair bench is to participate in an act of resistance against the culture of replacement. When a clockmaker spends hours cleaning, lubricating, adjusting, and repairing the movement, they are proving that time, once meant to be maintained, should not be discarded. The Westclox name, meanwhile, persists as a heritage brand, licensed and placed on a variety of modern, imported timepieces that bear little resemblance to the heavy, brass-geared machines of the Vale of Leven. But the original made-in-Scotland dials remain distinct. They serve as physical evidence of a time when the British working day was organized by a local, mechanical heartbeat. The site of the old Dumbarton factory itself has been reclaimed by new industrial use, leaving no trace of the millions of alarms that once echoed across the Vale of Leven. The factory walls that once resonated with the rhythmic ticking of thousands of simultaneous movements are long gone. Yet the legacy persists in the homes of families who still keep a family clock on the bedside table, a relic of a grandfather's morning shift, or a memory of a time when the house had a mechanical rhythm of its own. We have moved from a world of mechanical mainsprings to a world of silent, glowing screens. We no longer wind the hour. We simply glance at the light. But there is a loss in this transition that goes beyond nostalgia. In trading the winding key for the digital alarm, we have traded an active, tactile contract with our own schedules for a passive, invisible one. We have gained convenience, but we have lost the physical proof that time is something we own. Somewhere in a British bedroom, an old Baby Ben sits quiet on a wooden cabinet, its brass key resting in a bedside drawer, its bell long silent, its mechanical heart ready for one more careful turn of the spring. If you enjoyed this journey into the history of British timekeeping, subscribe and join us again as we uncover the next lost empire of British craft.